Russia reportedly has over 1,500 helicopters, and they were central to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And as far as we know nowadays, they have already lost over 100 helicopters, but they still get a lot of use out of them. So why can't Russia stop using helicopters? That's the question I'm going to answer in this video. Welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm Chris, and I love talking about air power every Thursday here on the channel on what I call MAD, Military Aviation History Day. And this video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. If you are interested in this video and how helicopters fit into military operations, it is likely that you will enjoy Conflict of Nations, a free online PvP strategy game that lets you choose a real country in a simulated modern global war. You can fight or forge alliances with up to 128 other players and participate in week-long real-time games that test your tactics and strategic mind. Build up armies of tanks, jets, helicopters and ships, plan out and participate in complex military operations, and play using both PC and your mobile on the go. Sign up for free via the link in the description in the next 30 days to get an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription to get you off to a flying start. To answer this question then, why Russia can't stop using helicopters, I'm going to start at the tactical level and then branch out to the big picture and bring it all together by the end of the video. What we have to recognize very much at the start of this is that the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia in terms of military doctrine, in terms of military operations, has been a fairly consistent one. Russia very much continued to use those large-scale conventional forces that the West, due to the war on terror and a lot of sort of foreign interventions, went away from, and with more rapid and more flexible response units. Although, of course, NATO's rapid response units also have their origin in Cold War, but that's in a completely other topic. So let's go into helicopters here. Starting then out with the baseline capabilities of the helicopter, we have such a flexible machine. It can do reconnaissance, liaison, medevac and search and rescue. It can do transportation, anti-submarine duties. It can do insertion, air mobile, air assault, close-in call-in, close air support, command and control, even electronic warfare. The Russians have fielded some of that capability as well in Ukraine, as well as then generic sort of ground attack, as well as specialized anti-tank duties or anti-vehicle duties. And the way I presented that also with the duties that I just came at you with, that's basically the overall trajectory that helicopters got used. First in that sort of supportive role, and then becoming a more active kinetic force within the armed forces as well. And we see that not just in the Soviet Union, but also in the West. So think back, for example, during the Cold War, Vietnam. The Americans with their Hueys and their air mobile and air assault units providing flexible response units, flying to specific points, landing troops there, and the helicopters that bring these units, so the Hueys or Iroquois if we want to be correct, then we are talking about helicopters that were built for transportation duties, but after a while they were also given rocket pods or additional machine guns in order to then, as they're landing on LZs and as they're getting out of the LZs, provide some fire support as well. So there's sort of that trajectory that you can see from the transportation duty over to a more kinetically applied capability as well. And before I continue now with Russia, I do have to mention that the Vietnam War is not necessarily the reason why Russia went heavily into helicopters. They certainly kept an eye on it and they certainly were influenced at it, but we start seeing a tendency to use helicopters already in Korea from the Soviet Union, and they've sort of kept an eye on the whole development and then shifted more towards helicopters definitely by the 1980s, but that's not necessarily just because of Vietnam. But if you look at the helicopters that the Soviet Union fielded throughout its history, let's go with a couple of examples. We're starting with the the MIL series, right? But the Mi-1s or the Hares, and then we're going to the Hoplites, the Hounds and the Hips, and then we're coming to the Hind, the Mi-24 Revolution as I like to call it, where suddenly you have a helicopter that combines a lot of capabilities into one. It can do transport, it can do air mobile and air assault operations, it can do attack, it can do specialized AT as well. The the Hind has a lot of things up its sleeve that it can do for the Soviet Union and then Russia. And then of course with the Havoc, the Mi-28, we have a more specialized attack helicopter platform as well. And then you look at the other companies that operated in the Soviet Union at the time. Specifically now, let's look at Kamov. We see the same tendency. There's a little bit more navalized focus in there as well. but we have a helicopter that again went from a trajectory of being a supportive platform, reconnaissance, over to transport and anti-submarine duties, to then also providing more attack duties as well, with now the Alligators, the KA, or the KA, depending on how you want to say it, 52s. Now, as we have this whole picture of all these helicopters that Russia has and that the Soviet Union had before it, why? You don't just buy stuff, you buy them for a reason. And here we have to branch out to the big picture in order to understand how the helicopter fits into the military thinking of the Soviet Union / Russia. And that's because, in the future, countries look at this in sort of a way and say, in the future, we want to fight in a specific way. This is how we're currently fighting, and we're going to shift that over, or we're going to make some modifications, we're going to change over and add new additional capabilities to that. And that's why we need to buy capability X, Y, and Z. And the helicopter here comes into play. I'm sure if you've looked at sort of the Soviet Union, even starting in the 1920s, 1930s definitely, and then going over all the way to the end of the Cold War and now into Russia, that you've come across things like operational art, deep battle, deep operations. Those have their origin in the pre-World War II period, and that is the basic military doctrine and the basic military thinking of the Soviet Union. And I don't want to make this a doctrine video, but very quickly here, deep battle, basically what you have to think of is a full-scale assault along a wide frontage where the Soviet Union fields a lot of units, sort of the first echelon attack, or echelon, depending on how you want to pronounce that particular word. And then you attack your adversary, and that is sort of the tactical battle. And as cracks forms and you have penetrations, you can then funnel into the second echelon units, which are mechanized, motorized, very fast units that can then exploit that penetration, have the break-in, and then run into depth over a wider frontage, right? And that's basically the decisive axis that then the Soviet Union wants to exploit by funneling all those troops in there while the enemy is still reeling under this wide frontage attack and can't really necessarily bring in reserves. And as they're bringing in reserves, you want to have, for example, Air Force units or helicopters that then strike the new defensive positions before they can actually reset and be prepared, or that strike the reinforcements that are coming in, or that take out specific points along the way to deny the enemy the ability to rush in forces, like, for example, taking bridges or taking transportation lines, or I don't know, blowing up railway lines or something like that. That's where that comes in. And then the operational art, of course, ties in sort of the tactical battle over to the strategic level, and that encompasses the whole thing. But as I said, this is not a doctrine video. There's going to be recommendations also in the descriptions where you can read more about Russian military thinking or Soviet military thinking there. And air, as I've already teased, is a central component to supporting the decisive axis of advance of the Soviet/Russian forces. And it was so from the very start. So if you look at the pre-Stalinist purges period in the 1930s, air was already teased in such a way. It is definitely so during World War II. I recently made a video about that. You can have a look. And it is still relevant in Russian military thinking here. And as then Russia puts a emphasis on the deep battle and deep operations, it puts, to the forefront centralized operations, surprise, initiative, speed, a wide frontage, and lots of troops being funneled in, but not haphazardly, quite dedicatedly. And it wants to exploit those larger gaps. It wants to carry forward the momentum, and it wants to cut off enemy reinforcements, supply points, specific reserves, and so on. And air is to support this. So I don't want to dwell on doctrine. So let me summon the spirit of Major Alan Dutch Schaefer and say, let's get to the chopper. The capabilities of the helicopter were added into this air component as well, with supporting large-scale operations. We have a general in the Soviet Union at the trailing edge of the 1980s, who said, and I quote, "The success of offensive operations of the land forces was doubtful unless mass use is made of helicopters." And there we can already start seeing sort of the focus that the Russian armed forces, or the Soviet armed forces then, and the Russian armed forces inherit that legacy placed on the helicopter for these mass assaults, these deep battle and then deep operations that they want to do. And the helicopter, due to its flexible employment characteristics, is very helpful in that. It can bring basically air power with very little preparedness. And the way the Soviet Union had set it up is that you had dedicated air regiments of helicopters and assault helicopters that were supporting specific armies on the ground in order to support them during their attacks. And what this does is you are able to bring out a lot of firepower and a lot of manpower to specific points very quickly within that tactical engagement of a deep battle, and also then later on deep operations. And you can support the deep penetrations by the operational maneuver groups on the ground very, very responsively and very, very flexibly. And that helps you to overcome basically static defense units, just like NATO fielded in the early to mid sort of period of the Cold War. And then also it is something that helps you counter more rapid response units that NATO came out with later on, sort of post-70s, because you have that speed and that flexibility to insert firepower and manpower where you want it at any given time if you have a lot of helicopters, right? And that local firepower, this is where I bring it back to Ukraine. We're still seeing this. The Russians are still making a lot of use out of helicopters, as far as the reports we are seeing from Ukraine of helicopters. Bringing in local firepower, even with rocket lobbing, sometimes also with gun attacks at standoff distances. So there's reports of like Mi-24 Hinds with the 30mm fixed gun, being at a standoff range and just lobbing shells at certain tree lines where they suspect the Ukrainian forces. Now, none of that really is in the sense of deep battle, that there is a wide frontage attack and that it supports specific elements on the ground in order to facilitate that break-in, but it is still happening. And when you look at the beginning, the opening stages of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, I mean, this was basically a textbook Soviet Union air mobile attack. Yeah, you have this large-scale air mobile operation that specifically went to Hostomel in order to take that airport and hold that airport, to then bring in more units with aircraft like Il-76s or something, and establish that foothold before the ground units arrive. Now that didn't work out because of various factors, but we know nowadays that the Battle of Hostomel Airport was a fairly close run thing. But when you then zoom out again and go away from the current military operations, you can start seeing why Russia can't stop helicopters, because their armed forces are set up in such a way that they want to exploit the helicopter as one of the capabilities that they have in their military operations. The helicopter is supposed to bring out direct army support in tactical engagements, and it is also supposed to fulfill a supportive role, and a very active supportive role, in deep operations by taking specific points with landing zones and having a lot of firepower in that area where maybe the defensive units aren't equipped to handle mass assault by helicopter and infantry at the same time. And that brings up quite a powerful tool in Russia's arsenal in order to maintain those sort of assaults and to facilitate the taking of specific points on the ground before the ground units arrive. Now, of course, the conditions have to be right for this. If there's a lot of air defense in the area, it's not going to work. If the ground units aren't fast enough to catch up with the air mobile insertion, that's not going to work. I mean, I hate to bring up Market Garden here, but that's a good example of what happens when ground forces cannot maintain the momentum and link up with the paratroopers, and it would be the same thing here. It would also not work if the adversary forces are able to bring in lots of reserve with lots of firepower very quickly in order to cut off the air mobiles units from the ground units that are rushing in. So all of these things are highly situational. In war, things do go wrong, but you start seeing of why the Russians have concentrated so much on helicopters, and why they now have this massive fleet of helicopters that still provides a very flexible platform to be used. And if the conditions are right, and if the conditions allow for another mass assault, then it is always possible that Russia will, in the opening stages of a larger operations, again use helicopters. Is that going to be happening in Ukraine? That is anybody's guess. I I don't have a crystal ball, I can't say that. But if Russia were to mount a military operation somewhere else, then I definitely think that there is a high chance that we're going to see something similar to the Hostomel operations that Russia mounted in February 2022 again. But at this point, I want to know from you what you think about Russian helicopter operations and where they're coming from and what their thinking is. And if you've learned anything from this video, if you want to add anything to this video, or hey, maybe you want to push back on a couple of points, let me know in the comments. Big thank you here to today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Remember that Conflict of Nations is completely free to sign up, so assume command over the future of any nation. Sign up in the next 30 days to get 13,000 gold and 1 month premium subscription via the link in the description. Choose your country, army, tactics, and forge the path to victory. As well as all of you and the patrons and the channel supporters who make this channel possible. I'll see you on next Thursday with another topic of air power. As always, have a great day and see you in the sky.